Hello everyone, welcome to Story Vault YouTube channel. In today's video, we will read some of the creepiest horror stories. Hope you enjoy the video. Story 1. The Whispering Shadows. Every night, Claire heard whispering from the shadows in her room. The voices grew louder and clearer, murmuring secrets of the house. One evening, she decided to confront them. "What do you want?" she asked. The whispering ceased, replaced by a chilling voice. "We're not whispering to you. We're whispering about you." Story 2. The Reflection. James glanced at the antique mirror he bought from a flea market, admiring its craftsmanship. Later that night, he noticed something odd. His reflection was a moment behind his movements. As he leaned in closer, his reflection suddenly smiled, even though James hadn't. Story 3. The Locked Door. Maggie always wondered why the basement door in her new house was locked. One night, she found the key and decided to explore. As she descended the creaky stairs, she noticed old photographs on the walls, each one of her, asleep in bed. She turned to leave, but the door was no longer there. Story 4. The Doll. Lily found an old, porcelain doll in her grandmother's attic. Despite its cracked face and faded dress, she felt drawn to it. She took it home and placed it on her shelf. That night, she woke up to the sound of tiny footsteps. She looked over and saw the doll standing at the foot of her bed, its cracked lips moving as if whispering something. The next morning, the doll was back on the shelf, but its eyes seemed to follow her every move. Story 5. The Haunting Melody. Sam moved into an old house known for its beautiful piano. Every night, he heard a haunting melody echoing through the halls. One night, he decided to investigate. As he reached the piano, he saw a ghostly figure playing. It turned to him, and with hollow eyes, whispered, "Join me." Story 6. The Whispering Shadow. In a small, forgotten town, an old man lived alone in a decrepit house at the edge of the woods. Every night, he would hear faint whispers coming from the shadows, calling his name. He tried to ignore them, but the whispers grew louder and more insistent. One night, he decided to confront the source. Armed with a flashlight, he ventured into the woods, following the eerie voices. The whispers led him to a clearing where a shadowy figure stood, its face obscured. As he approached, the whispers ceased, replaced by a chilling silence. The shadowy figure reached out, and the old man felt a cold hand grip his wrist. He tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, dragging him into the darkness. The next morning, the townspeople found the old man's house empty, the whispers now echoing through the town, searching for a new victim. Story 7. The Silent Passenger. Late one night, a woman was driving home on an empty highway. The road was dark, and she was eager to reach home. As she drove, she noticed a hitchhiker standing on the side of the road, his thumb outstretched. Against her better judgment, she decided to offer him a ride. The hitchhiker climbed into the back seat and sat silently. The woman tried to make small talk, but he remained quiet, staring out the window. As the miles passed, she began to feel uneasy, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. When she finally reached her destination, she turned to tell the hitchhiker they had arrived. To her horror, the back seat was empty. Shaken, she drove home and told her husband what had happened. He listened, his face growing pale. "That highway is known for ghost sightings," he said. "People see a silent hitchhiker who disappears before reaching their destination." Story 8. The Haunted Mirror. In an antique shop, a woman found an ornate mirror that seemed to call to her. She bought it and hung it in her bedroom. That night, she awoke to a strange sensation, as if someone was watching her. She glanced at the mirror and saw a shadowy figure standing behind her reflection. Terrified, she spun around, but no one was there. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination and went back to sleep. Over the next few nights, the figure grew clearer, its eyes staring at her with malevolent intent. Desperate, she covered the mirror with a sheet, hoping to block out the haunting presence. But the whispers began, voices coming from beneath the sheet, calling her name. The woman tried to get rid of the mirror, but it always found its way back into her house. In the end, she smashed the mirror into pieces. As the shards scattered, she felt a cold breeze sweep through the room. The haunting stopped, but she was left with a constant feeling of being watched, never truly free from the shadowy figure's gaze. Story 9. The Silent Call. Sarah was home alone when the phone rang. She picked it up, but no one answered. She hung up, only for it to ring again immediately. This time, she heard faint breathing on the other end. She hung up once more, but the phone rang again and again. Each time the breathing grew louder. Panicking, she unplugged the phone, but it rang one last time. Trembling, she answered, and a voice whispered, "I'm right behind you." Story 10. The Empty Room. Tom had just moved into his new apartment when he noticed the door to one of the rooms was always locked. The landlord assured him it was just an old storage room, but Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One night, he heard faint music coming from the locked room. He pressed his ear against the door and heard a child's voice singing a lullaby. The next day, he asked the landlord about it again, but the landlord looked confused and said, "What locked room? There's no such room in your apartment." Story 11. The Silent Room. In an old, decrepit hospital, there was a room no one dared enter. Room 606 was sealed off after a patient died mysteriously, and rumors spread that it was cursed. The staff avoided it, and new hires were warned to stay away. One night, a young nurse named Lisa, curious and skeptical of the tales, decided to investigate. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was thick and cold, and the room was eerily silent. She turned on her flashlight and saw a single hospital bed, perfectly made. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. She tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The silence was broken by a faint, raspy whisper. "Help me." Lisa spun around, but there was no one there. Panic set in as the whispers grew louder, coming from all directions. The temperature dropped, and she could see her breath in the air. The bed began to shake violently, and she felt an invisible force pulling her toward it. Desperate, she managed to pry the door open and escape. She never spoke of what she experienced, but she never worked the night shift again. Room 606 remained sealed, its whispers echoing through the empty halls. Story 12. The Old Mansion. In the heart of a forgotten forest, an old mansion stood, abandoned and decaying. Children dared not approach, for it was said the shadows whispered there. One stormy night, a curious boy named Tom ventured inside, flashlight in hand. As he walked through the dusty halls, he heard faint whispers calling his name. "Tom, Tom." The voices grew louder, more insistent. He reached a room at the end of the corridor. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, the walls were covered in old, faded portraits of children, all with eerily lifelike eyes. "Join us, Tom." Before he could react, the shadows enveloped him, and his flashlight flickered out. The next morning, the mansion remained as silent as ever. Only now, one more portrait adorned the walls, with eyes that followed every passerby. Story 13. The Lonely Doll. Emily found the porcelain doll at a garage sale. It was old, with a cracked face and lifelike eyes. She cleaned it up and placed it on her shelf, thinking it would be a charming addition to her collection. That night, she heard soft footsteps in her room. She turned on the light, but there was no one there. She shrugged it off and went back to sleep. The next morning, the doll was no longer on the shelf. Instead, it was sitting on her bedside table, facing her. Days passed, and every night the footsteps grew louder. Emily began to see shadows moving in the corners of her eyes. One night, she woke up to find the doll standing at the foot of her bed, its eyes fixed on her. "I just want a friend," it whispered. Terrified, Emily tried to throw the doll away, but it always found its way back. Eventually, she locked it in the attic, hoping to forget. Years later, when she moved out, she left the house to her sister. The doll remained, waiting patiently for its next companion. Story 14. The Harvest Scarecrow. In one particular quiet village, farmers relied on scarecrows to protect their crops. Among them was a particularly sinister one, known as Old Jeb. With tattered clothes and a straw-stuffed body, Old Jeb stood tall in the middle of a cornfield, his eyes two hollow, black buttons that seemed to watch every passerby. As the years went by, stories began to circulate about Old Jeb. People whispered that it was cursed, that it moved on its own at night. Livestock went missing, crops withered mysteriously, and some claimed to hear strange, guttural whispers coming from the fields after dark. One autumn, a young man named Jack, skeptical of the legends, decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a sturdy resolve, he ventured into the cornfield one moonless night. The wind rustled the dry leaves, creating an eerie symphony of whispers. As Jack approached Old Jeb, he felt a chill run down his spine. The scarecrow's black button eyes seemed to follow him, glinting ominously in the darkness. He laughed nervously, trying to shake off his fear. Suddenly, the air grew thick, and the whispers became more pronounced, forming words that chilled Tom to the bone. "Leave now." Jack's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. He reached out to touch Old Jeb, determined to prove it was just a harmless scarecrow. The moment his fingers brushed the straw, Old Jeb's head jerked to life. Its button eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and a twisted, toothless grin spread across its burlap face. "You were warned," it rasped, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. Terrified, Jack stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight. He turned to run, but the cornfield seemed to close in around him, the stalks reaching out like grasping hands. The last thing he saw was Old Jeb advancing, its limbs creaking and snapping as it moved with unnatural speed. The next morning, the villagers found the cornfield undisturbed, except for one detail. Old Jeb now wore Jack's hat, its grin wider than ever. So, that's the end of the story. Hit the like button and subscribe. Have a good day and see you in the next video.